Thank you very much. Welcome to the third Dharmanaut Circle. I've been having a good time here. I've got some fewer folks tonight, but I didn't pump it at all. This week was crazy. I've been traveling, so as you can see, I'm in somewhere north with the aurora borealis. Not really, but I've been traveling, so it's been a little hairy, but interesting time. I just want to let folks know that we are recording these now, and so they'll be available on the YouTube channel, and I will put that link for the whole collection in the chat, so you can go back and listen to it if you want, or turn people on to let them know about this. And I do appreciate it if you do let people know, because it's a very word of mouth kind of situation. I'm not too into promo, especially these days. So that's always nice to kind of pass it along. Tonight, I wanted to talk about the gate of sound, which for me has been the most important sense gate as a form of practice, as a vehicle of ecstasy, as a way of exploring the self. And we could talk a lot about music, and I welcome folks to to ask about this or share your ideas and experiences during the Q&A. There's a lot to say about psychedelics and music, particularly in regards to the sacred. It's obviously an to my mind, the most important art. Visual art is obviously very visionary and helps us sort of shape and articulate and concretize visions. But there's, in terms of the actual dynamics of psychedelic experience, I think that pride of place goes to music. And even the question of the playlist is a really interesting kind of problem in a way, for how do we think about the playlist? What do you put on a playlist? What is the ideal playlist? And right now, the playlist thing is like booming as yet another zone of this increasingly ridiculous and yet seemingly world transforming psychedelic renaissance, where people are coming out with kind of like they're the expert at creating the playlist that is going to give you what you need for your psychedelic experience. And there's like kind of a new crop of experts that aren't DJs, although you'd think that like a DJ could just be like, yeah, I'm a DJ. I know how to do this. And there's a lot of questions to be asked about that. And, especially in terms of like, well, what kind of music do you put on it? How far, do you put heavy metal on it? Do you put, scary industrial music because you want to have some scary industrial parts of your trip? Or no, you want to not do that. And so there's a lot of discussions. Some of them are sophisticated. A lot of them are kind of anodyne. And we haven't really talked about that here, so that could be a fun thing to discuss. But I don't want to talk about music. I want to talk about sound and practicing with sound. And I don't usually go riff off of text, but I've been thinking about Dogen lately. I saw a wonderful, really great lecture by A.H. Almos, the guy who does the Diamond Heart. If you're not familiar with him, very interesting, very intelligent thinker on the kind of border of psychology and spirituality. And he's been doing a series of public lectures on various non-dual traditions, and they're fascinating. They're highly recommended. I think you can find them if you just dig into the Diamond Heart website. What makes them interesting is that, in my experience, a lot of non-dual discourse, if you get around people who are really into non-dualism, it all sounds the same to the point of boredom. And one of the interesting things about Almas is that he's very realized, or he's had a lot of experiences, even though he's very down to earth and doesn't put out a particularly charismatic vibe. But he's very interested in the differences between different thinkers, rather than emphasizing the similarities. So when he talks about Krishnamurti, when he talks about Nisargadatta, and then when he just gave this lecture on Dogen, he emphasizes their differences, that the world of realization is a world of many different kinds of experiences, and maybe they all relate, and maybe there are some ultimates in there, but the point is to look at things as a diversity. And I think it's a very helpful, very necessary way of approaching awakening and practice, to look at that kind of multiplicity. And he said some very interesting things about Dogen. And so I wanted to share something from Dogen's Genjo Koan, which is probably one of his most famous pieces of writing. He was a 12th century Zen master. If you hadn't heard, he went to China and studied in China and came back and basically kind of founded his own school. And he was unusually, I don't want to say he's an intellectual, though he was an intellectual, but just a philosophically rich thinker. And so this is from Genjo Koan. To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. I'm just going to read the whole thing and riff on it a bit. When you see forms or hear sounds fully engaging body and mind, you grasp things directly. Unlike things and their reflections in the mirror, and unlike the moon and its reflection in the water, when one side is illuminated, the other side is dark. And then here's the most famous part of this fascicle. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So this is a wonderful taste of Dogen, partly because you get a sense of both the sort of, there's a trickiness or intricacy about it, but also a clear presence of a kind of awakening that is elusive or enigmatic. Although in some ways, this is a very helpful way of describing particularly Zen practice, but in a way that I think is helpful for what I want to talk about tonight, which is about dealing with sound. So if we start out with this idea of to carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. So I'll be talking about how we experience sound. So he's right away pointing to two different ways of doing this. One is that I put myself out there as the hearer, the listener. I'm engaged with listening. I'm bringing myself forward into the situation of my experience in order to recognize things, hear things, acknowledge things. But he contrasts this with something else, that myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. What does that mean? Well, I mean, it's still that things are happening. You're still, in the case that I'll be talking about, or that I am talking about, hearing. You're still in a world of sound in which sounds are happening, and you are attending to the sounds that are happening, but you're not bringing yourself forward. Instead, there's a kind of hollowing out or a receptivity that allows not just sounds to happen, but also your own listening to happen. And that's a really kind of subtle tension. And if it seems still a little vague, it's made more clear in the famous part, which I'll read again. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. Okay, that's an interesting turn. If I'm looking at the self, I realize that it's insufficient. And anything that I find about it, any idea of who I am, any practice that I'm holding on to, it vaporizes in a way. It becomes empty in sort of classic Buddhist terms. There's a quality of emptiness in the self. But even more than just recognizing that the self is empty, which doesn't mean that it's not there, but it means that it doesn't exist the way it feels like it exists most of the time as we go through our day and get things and get frustrated and have arguments and fall in love and all these things. It feels like there's this real solidity or substance to the self. It's not that those things aren't happening. It's just that if you look at them from another perspective, they're empty. They don't have the substance that they seem to. And once you begin to see that, there's a kind of opening and a kind of spaciousness that enters into your experience. But he's saying something a little bit more. Just forget the self. Forget the way you take phenomena and begin to do things with it. the doer who's making something mean something, for example. Maybe it's meaningless. Maybe it's just there. Why am I always making meaning or finding pattern? It's that way that we work our own experience obsessively that he's suggesting can be suspended or, forgotten in a sense, to forget it. And to forget it, then this is the really beautiful move. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad beings. Notice that he's saying, so it's almost like by forgetting this, by becoming receptive, by letting go of my usual plots and plans and hunts for meaning, I create a space where realization can happen out of my own terms, out of my own control, in a sense. It happens because myriad things, the world, in its diversity, it's not one thing, it's myriad things, it's everything, can come forward and actualize itself, and in so doing, become awakening. And why I think this is important to think about in terms of working with sound is that, and you could talk about it with visual too, but just in my experience, there's something about the way that sound presents itself as this multiplicity in which there is a single action of listening, and at the same time, all of this diversity. We're in a 3D soundscape. I can hear sounds over here, over there, coming from over there. There's the hum in my ear. There's my internal sounds. I'm in this sort of diverse landscape of sound. And so bringing attention to that listening and allowing sort of sounds to come forward rather than seeking them and driving my mind into what's going on allows for this kind of space of awakening and a kind of hearing that's really quite profound. I mean, in my experience, listening practice can really be a gate to a kind of non-dualism where there's just sound happening. It's neither happening outside, neither happening inside. It's not all lumped into one thing. It's this diverse domain that I'm sort of a part of, or I'm sort of witnessing. And so, I wanted to kind of bring that up as a way of kind of working with sensation inside of meditation in a way where, I am in some sense asking you to go out there and like encounter sensual phenomenon. It's not about like shutting down the mind by completely focusing on your breath such that everything else kind of falls away. That's another kind of meditation, very powerful kind of meditation, deep concentration where you're really just resting on a mantra, on a breath, on a visual field to the exclusion of everything else. And that's not what we're talking about. This is more about going out there and opening up to a diverse field of uncontrolled phenomena, just sound, whatever is happening in your environment, but also holding yourself in a certain way in relationship to that. It's like you're opening yourself up, but also stepping back and allowing. And that allowance makes room for this marvelous diversity. One of the things that Alma's talked about with Dogen, particularly around the non-dual, is he said most of the discourse around non-dualism is all about one, unity. Everything is, in fact, in a lot of traditions like Advaita Vedanta, it's like the surface of the world with all of its diversity, the myriad things, is kind of an illusion. And the real layer is unity, one mind, or Brahma. There's one thing. And so there tends to be an emphasis on this sense of unity, of melting down into oneness at the expense of the particular. And Almas made the point that for Dogen, the particular and the one mind are two sides of the same coin, that you don't need to leave the realm of diversity in order to get to the goods, that they are on the surface of the realm of diversity. And this is very resonant for me. It very much, personally has been important for me to kind of work with that sense of diversity, of the myriad things, and also to not not to fall into a simplistic. I mean, sometimes it makes sense to see this world as a construct, as an illusion, as something where you're caught up in fictions and myths and social ideas that you didn't have anything to do with. I mean, we do live in a realm of illusion, and in a sense, Buddhism harps on that all the time. But there's something else about awakening, about presencing, and about being in relationship to phenomena that Dogen is pointing out here, that it's not really about whether it's illusion or not. It's about phenomena, and not trying to break apart the particular in order to get to some abstract universal, but to, in a sense, find the universal in that singular moment. And that to me is also a guide to a certain kind of practice about how we relate to sensation, to taste, to smell, to visual experience, to sound, and even more how we relate to the enjoyment of sensation. And I don't just mean like, oh, that feels good or that tastes yummy, although that can be part of it too. I mean something deeper, where the phenomena of sensation itself becomes there's a quality of bliss to just sensing, regardless of what the sense is. So I'm talking about a quality of bliss that can be, or enjoyment that can be present even when you're like tasting something yucky. You're like, whoa, but there's a tasting, there's a vibrancy to experience and phenomena that I think is part of this kind of path. When we talk about Dharmanauts, you have to remember that Dharma means many things. And it means the Buddhist truth, of the Buddhist view of reality, where there's emptiness and there's a possibility of being connected to one mind. There's different ways, of course, of talking about it, depending on tradition. But Dharma also means thing, as in myriad things, as in myriad dharmas. And that's the word that Dogen's probably using there. I'm pretty sure he's using that word. And so in some sense, when we're Dharmanauts, we're like moving through a space of continual encounter in a world of diversity that isn't the way that we think it is. It's not the normal story. And yet it doesn't mean that the diversity, the particularity of all the phenomena disappear. So that leads me to the other quote I want to talk about, which is from another Zen guy named Bankai, who was a number of centuries later, kind of he was in the 1600s. And he says something very interesting. I'm just going to read it and then I'll reflect on it a little bit. Well, then what does it mean that you're endowed with a Buddha mind? His whole thing is that you've already got the Buddha mind. It comes with you. It's your birthright. You're already there. So what does it mean? What does it mean, say that you're endowed with a Buddha mind? Each of you now present decided to come here from your home in the desire to hear what I have to say. Now, if a dog barked beyond the temple walls while you're listening to me, you'd hear it and know it was a dog barking. If a crow cawed, you'd hear it and know it was a crow. You hear an adult's voice as an adult's, a child's as a child's. You didn't come here in order to hear a dog bark, a crow caw, or any of the other sounds which might come from outside the temple during my talk. Yet while you're here, you'd hear those sounds. You'd have no way of knowing beforehand any of the sights, sounds, or smells you might encounter at this meeting, yet you're able nonetheless to recognize these unforeseen sights and sounds as you can encounter them without premeditation. That's because you're seeing and hearing in the unborn. And that's sort of his word for the Buddha mind, is the unborn, meaning that it doesn't come into existence or fall out of existence. It's always already present. And it's always already present in our own subjectivity, in our own experience. And that's really the path that's open with this kind of way of looking at things, is that is that in the very act of experiencing, of sensing, of hearing a sound and of being intimate with the hearing of the sound, you are also cognizing, meeting, encountering, becoming intimate with that aspect of awareness, which is the unborn, which is not just coming and going, which has a kind of quality. You could call it timelessness if you want, although I think it gets sort of tricky to think about it, but it's something that's always already inside your mind stream as you are experiencing it now, right now, right now. Now that's, common sort of aspect of Buddhist, teaching. A lot of people talk about it. But what really interests me about Bankai's thing is he does something different than I think a lot of us think about, which is that we, and this is just sort of general kind of spiritual thinking about language, about identification. And that's the idea that like we go around the world and we have identify everything. We have names for everything. There's a lamp, there's, the dresser over here, there's the computer, and you have all these names. But to, really be in touch with phenomena, you break down these names and you get towards like the thing itself. So instead of like smelling a rose, somehow I like rose goes away and I'm just with the intimate recognition of this particular thing, which is maybe everything. There's a sense that names and identifications are not part of practice, that you're trying to get away from name and form, namarupa, in the wheel of phenomena, the wheel of causation. But Bankai here is saying something else. He's not saying like, wow, if you're really listening to my talk and you're really in touch with the unborn within you, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between a dog and a crow. He's not saying that. He's not saying that to be in the unborn is to be in some kind of pure immediacy where there's no longer any words, any signs, any gestures, any recognizable signposts. He's saying, no, you'd hear a dog and it wouldn't sound like a crow. And if it was then there was a crow, you'd hear a crow. You weren't ready for it. You weren't asking for it. You weren't expecting it. And yet you hear the crow. So this is very interesting because there's a reason we think we distrust language. There's a reason we think that there's a way to become more intimate with experience than just going, oh, it's another rose, because that idea, it kind of cuts us off. Can we really be with this experience and not just think of it, not just run our established cultural ideas or our scripts about what we do with roses or what roses mean or something like that. So that's valuable. But he's saying something else, which is that the recognition, the quality of recognition in the listening is part of the unborn, that the unborn has diversity. The unborn has something like knowledge. And in general, we push that stuff away in practice. It's not about getting knowledge. It's not about, recognizing diversity. Don't get caught up in what the sounds are. Just let the sounds rise and fall. That's great. That's all part of it for sure. But there's something else going on. There's something else about the encounter with a particular crow or a particular dog or a particular taxi cab or car alarm or, someone in the garbage. I mean, whatever, all the sounds we hear, probably a lot of us live in cities. A lot of those sounds are diverse and specific. So part of what I'm kind of allowing, and now we'll kind of dive into do a little practice with listening practice. And Brian, I'm going to ask you to talk about that when we're in Q&A, because that sounds interesting. And I've read that book, but I don't remember his talk on sounds. Is that this sort of mode, I think, gives us a different way of practicing with our phenomena and allowing something like recognition, because the recognition is also an encounter. It's not just, oh, I hear a crow. It's like crow, whatever crow is, that particular crow, the species of crow is now in relationship to me right now. And by recognizing it as crow, there's actually more intimacy than just like there's some deconstructed idea of, oh, there's a waveform that my mind tends to identify as crow, which is another kind of way of deconstructing phenomena in order to get to a deeper layer of the mind. And there's a lot of working along those lines. It relates to psychedelics in some interesting ways. But there is also this mode of kind of staying on the surface, not in a superficial way, deeply, intimately staying on the surface. Almas had one really wonderful metaphor here that I thought was hilarious and very true. Is he said that, like, in most non-dual teachings, they present reality as an onion. And what you do is you peel off the surfaces layer after layer after layer after layer to find the heart of the thing, which may be nothing, it may be Brahma, it may be the all, the absolute, whatever you want to call it. And he goes, Dogen is not an onion guy. He's a turnip guy. It's just like one thing. It's just one thing. It's the surface and the depth that doesn't really mean anything. Just the same way in what I had read initially, he talks about the reflection, the moon and the reflection of the water. And he says, it's not like that. When one side is illuminated, the other side is dark, meaning it's not two, it's just that. So there's no surface, there's no depth, there's just the turnip. And so, if that seems like an odd metaphor and you're like, what are you talking about? Think about it a little bit more, particularly in contrast with the onion. And that's really our normal way of being, seekers or meditators who are trying to get to the depths of things, is to get beyond the surface and not be taken, not to get fooled or get caught up with superficial phenomena. But within that, there are these opportunities. And I think the gate of sound is a particularly great way of being with this diverse phenomena, neither leaning towards it, not grabbing it, but also just allowing it to be in a way that can open up a lot. So I think I'll stop riffing there, and we'll do a sit and then talk about this or talk about music or playlists. And I'll get Brian to chat about Rudolf Steiner. Always fascinating to hear what that wild man has to say. So we're going to sit for about half an hour and just ask you to find a seat. You're welcome to turn off the video if you want. Just get yourself in a nice zone. As usual, want to emphasize a little bit of attention to the posture. If you're sitting on a chair, try to not sit with your back leaning against the back of the chair. Have that curve at the base of your spine, curving forward, your pelvis spilling forward slightly. It's, easiest to sit on a pillow to do this. But, any way you can get there, but try to keep the back largely free of a surface. And really try to kind of almost like imagine the spine as a sort of stack of plates, and you're kind of like balancing them. Like allow yourself to sort of play a little bit, like maybe even circulate the spine a little bit, lean a little bit forward, a little bit back, side to side, very subtly, and kind of circle around a sense of balance, as if your spinal column again is sort of balanced and you're holding it at the root, you're holding it in the pelvis. And one way of helping that process again is to open up the chest slightly, allow the front of the chest to tug forward and the shoulder blades to melt down the back of the spine. Open up the back of the neck, so you're tucking in your chin ever so slightly, allowing space to open up in the back of the neck. That really opens up and clarifies the energy moving through the body, if you want to think about it that way. It just feels good. So just find your seat, maybe go over this. Again, you can always exaggerate slightly. That's one way I've always liked to do it, just exaggerate, really put the chest forward and go, okay, that's more than I need. And then what's a nice balance? Middle way. Find the middle way in your body. Hmm. Maybe you already notice how your breathing shifts slightly as you settle into a comfortable and upright posture. And whether you find concentration through the breath or perhaps some other method, let's just spend a few minutes settling down. If you don't know what to do, follow the breath. You can focus on the tip of the nose, the throat, or my favorite, the bottom of the belly. But really what comes easiest for you to just hold in your mind loosely or to follow it in and out. I'm sure everyone here has been practicing with this for a spell, but let's just find some concentration in the next few minutes. If you're distracted, just gently return to the breath. You can even imagine your restlessness or your distracting thoughts sort of leaving your body on the exhale. So just invite any agitation or distraction to exit with your breath. Notice if you're holding any tension in your body. You might not be aware of it. So as we settle down, especially if you find yourself distracted, see if there's some place you can relax a bit more. One way is to just reconnect with your posture and see where there's some block or some tension and allow the posture itself to release uh, any distraction or knots in your energy. Now allow yourself to open to sound. Part of this involves hearing what's around you. It's totally fine if you identify different sounds. I'm not asking you to not sort of explore here. It's totally fine. You might even kind of make a catalog because usually there's dominant sounds maybe coming through the window, but there's other sounds. Hum of electricity, of your computer, a cat purring, maybe your own belly grumbling, maybe even a certain electrical sounding signal within the licit phenomena of listening itself, which is something that sometimes becomes more apparent in meditation, can even become annoying sometimes. So as you listen, just notice, if you will, how you listen. Do you kind of lean forward and grab a hold of a sound in order to give it a name or to recognize it? That tends to be how we start off, especially with a loud sound. Suddenly we're fully focused on that one noise. That's fine, but see if you can sort of sit back a little bit more. And again, depending on what environment you are in, this may or may not be effective, and you'll have to tune into quieter sounds, but they're always sound. There's always sound, even if it's just the rush of blood in your ears. So see what happens if you kind of let go of grasping after the sound and just allow it to be where it is, to be what it is. One way to approach this is to allow the sounds, everything that's arising and falling away, to recognize that they are happening within a space. This is the space that our nervous system conjures from its own structure, from our two ears, from our brain, from our body in space, from our cognition. And so it's like we're sitting in a large dome, an empty dome within which sound occurs, over our right shoulder, up to the left, straight in front of us. All these sounds are happening within a broader stage, a sort of sphere of potential sound. And part of sitting with sound is to allow specific sounds to rise and fall, even with your own recognition of them. I'm hearing cars go by, but if it's a motorcycle, I recognize a motorcycle. But by releasing your grip of those particular sounds, they begin to sort of be just part of this larger space of possible sound, or a space of hearing. So sit with that a little bit and see if you can almost play with it as sounds arise. Notice the difference between focusing on the particular sound, investigating it, grasping it, and allowing it simply to arise within this larger space that is not just sound, it's also self or no self. And it becomes part of the gateway, this kind of negative space of sound that surrounds vividly all particular events. establishing this space of sound is helpful, because then when you go in and you investigate particular sounds, you're less likely to just grab a hold of them the way we conventionally do. And indeed, if you get sort of caught up or overly distracted, you can always fall back to this embrace of being in a kind of empty dome of potential sound. A kind of active silence. If you're lucky enough to have some traffic, and I mean it, you can notice how sounds move. And the movement of the sound reminds you of the space within which it is happening. It's from here, it's moving over there. It's like someone has drawn a bright, brilliant light line of color that's dancing, that's surfing through space. Well, that space is this space of sound, of active silence that is always present, always enlivening. So we're going to stay with this sense, this question of location. If you're hearing vivid sounds that are clearly happening outside of you, that's fine. Just recognize, where is this sound happening? That's the koan of this sit. Where is this sound happening? Since we're not sharing the same space, it's a little more difficult, but if you have overt sounds like traffic, it's usually pretty clear. It's kind of happening out there where the cars are. If you're in a quieter environment, maybe you're hearing electrical hum or your own nervous system, it's a little subtler and can be just as powerful. Where is this sound happening? Where is it happening? It's fine if you get distracted with particular sounds, but just in the same way that we return to the breath, is you return to that sense of a sphere of sound, that sphere of active silence within which specific sounds are happening. One analogy that might be helpful is, it's a bit like a symphony, where there's all these different instruments making their own sounds, yet there's a sense of a composition in the space. All this diversity is composed in relation with everything else. And you can hear that way, even when not listening to music, as if everything that's appearing in the sonic field has its place, belongs in this composition that is your hearing. if specific sounds keep pulling you away or drawing you towards them, I'll simply allow them to be. There's a quality of allowance that creates space around the attractiveness of particular sounds. And just keep returning to that sense of space, that spaciousness, this active silence that's able to form itself as particular sounds moving through time, through space, dissolving. Really sit with it. Where is it happening? And I welcome you to think about this. Where is it happening? In our culture, well, we know there's a big, 1-ton vehicle out there that's moving and, pushing sound waves through the air, which is actually a kind of matter, and it's coming in, the waves are being propagated into my ear. To whatever scientific degree we know that story, we know the basic model. That's fine. So that's where it's happening. It's happening out there. Well, really? I mean, hearing isn't happening out there. Maybe the car is moving out there, whatever that means. But the hearing is happening, well, in here. Play with that. Out there, in here. Right now, your nervous system is weaving the phenomenal response of sound to these waveforms bouncing around the air. So where is it happening? If you have strong external sounds, you can just watch yourself over and over again go, that's outside, that's outside, that's happening out there. But even just from a science perspective, nothing mystical about it. The sound isn't happening out there. So where is it? Are you able to recognize these sounds arising as happening inside? As you do so, perhaps you start to notice subtle interior sounds more, a kind of buzzing in the ear or your heartbeat. But are these sounds really inside? What does that mean? They're part of the same, they're arising in the same sphere, the same dome of active silence as the external sounds. Are they inside? Inside what? So here's a good example of how you can invite your mind into a sitting practice, a sensation practice, in a very particular way by asking it, where is this happening? Mind. Oh, it's happening outside. Really? Well, what about this? Oh, well, it's happening inside. Really? And you can play with the way in which you habitually construct sound as occurring inside or outside, pulling the rug out from under wherever you think the sound is, very subtly, with great attention. You can suspend the sound from happening anywhere that's located in some structure of inside and outside. That boundary becomes a little absurd, flickering, amorphous. So let yourself play that way for a little bit. It might not last very long, but perhaps you get glimpses of sound simply arising, no longer being located on the axis of inside and out, or listening arising alongside the external signal. Or simply listening, hearing. And how to treat, how to engage, how to embrace, how to recognize these sounds that arise wherever they're happening. One way of encountering them is to, as it were, feel their texture. This is a way of penetrating the tendency simply to identify phenomena, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thereby not really be present to its unfolding. And the idea here is that all sound has some texture to it. In music, they call it timbre. So a violin playing C isn't the same sound as a piano playing the same pitch. What is the difference? The difference is the timbre, the texture, the cluster of overtones that make up that particular sound. if we are music lovers, especially with certain kinds of music, we know this already. We know that to appreciate the sounds of ambient music or the particular tone of an extraordinary violin or the resonant hum of Hindustani classical music, that we really get into the texture or the taste, the particular taste of the sound. So now that we've established this kind of space of active silence, a sort of stage upon which sounds are rising and falling, I invite you to enjoy them. Enjoy them through the process of feeling their texture or of tasting their particular tang. That sound, which in some sense has never quite happened just that way. If it's a subtle sound, it's a subtle taste. A loud sound, vibrant. But the tasting, the feeling of the texture, that practice has a continuity to it that tells you something deeper about what's going on. Now, to close, take that enjoyment, that sense of encountering specific sounds that arise, and see if you can sort of expand it to take in this whole space of sound, or this dome of active silence, the sort of potential for sound that surrounds you. Taste the whole thing, the whole composition. All right, let's end the meditation there. I'm traveling, so I don't have my any bells, which is kind of funny given our topic. But thanks for going on that ride. And welcome back. I realize it's a little difficult to do because of course, everyone's in a different kind of environment. You know, I often think about things to do for this class that involve shared experiences, because partly because I'm really interested in the kind of sensory side of things. So it's sort of difficult to do. I've thought about, well, I could make a recording and everybody gets it and that, so it's too complicated. You know, when we were doing the psychedelic sanghas in person, sometimes we do music things, or I'd bring certain pieces of music, you know, and maybe I'll sort of riff a little bit here as people kind of settle in and, like, you know, find themselves again, about how much this kind of practice that I was just sort of exploring can be worked through just listening to music, both in terms of enhancing your ability to listen to music, appreciate what's going on with music, but also the fact that anytime you're listening to music, you can develop these muscles. You start to train the ability to have that kind of composition mind where events are occurring, they're interrelating, they have their own texture and density, they're in motion, and they're occurring within sort of a larger kind of soundscape. And in terms of like the technical production of music and all that, like these are all sort of terms that are really into it. If you're a musician or a producer or whatever, you have your own detailed way of describing these same kinds of relationships. But just as a listener, you can become kind of intimate with music in a different way through paying attention to listening itself, and how that happens, what's actually existing in a song, breaking down the song into tracks, really going into these sort of detailed modes of hearing, can also be sort of training for a way of listening that very much supports a kind of meditative experience beyond the following a song or listening to a particular piece of music. So they're deeply related, which is, I think, partly why music is such a powerful medium in particularly in ritual spaces and ceremonial spaces and ecstatic dance spaces, and just the way that many of us feed our souls. Not everyone loves music, but most people do. I think it's partly because of the way it allows us to engage an aspect of our sensory experience that is particularly soulful or particularly conducive to the spirit. So I'm curious if anybody wants to reflect on we have Chris Mays